Hey everyone, this is Nico Aleman with TheFloatLife, the TFL Pro race team, and with another rep your set for you guys, featuring my very own race board.
What you gonna do? Rep your set, yeah we fresh to death, from east to west, float on my friends. Rep your set, yeah we fresh to death, from east to west, float on my friends.
So this is one a lot of you guys have been asking for a very long time, but I always wanted to wait until I felt like my build was really not only dialed, but also featured parts that are accessible or soon to be accessible for you guys, so you can build something similar on your own without having to get too DIY. Right off the bat, it's obviously a very aggressive looking build. It's definitely specific to racing, aggressive trail riding, maybe even mobbing streets at really high speeds. It's not something that's gonna be for everyone. I usually prefer just like a growler setup for cruising around town, or maybe an MTE build as a all-rounder kind of board. But this build is definitely for when I want to come out and really play. So there's lots of goodies on the outside, but I'm actually gonna start with what's on the inside of this guy. So like a lot of the other guys in the shop, I'm actually running a VESC-based build. It is on the XR platform. It's something I personally prefer over the GT platform or even the XR Classic. The XR Classic is definitely a lot more comfortable than the GT platform, but there's still something about the original XR that just hasn't quite been beat yet. Jeff really said it best in his rep your set. It feels like you're sitting in it, while the others kind of feel like you're sitting on top of it. So the XR platform is always where I've had the most fun, and it feels like the board's really just an extension of your body. So if you're not familiar with VESC, it's essentially an open source motor control firmware. A lot of DIYers in the community are using it for their own boards as an alternative to Future Motion one wheels. This allows using a variety of different controllers, batteries, motors. It basically just opens up the floodgates. I'm not gonna dive deep into the details, but if you just search up VESC one wheel, that's VESC one wheel, you can find plenty of details online. Starting with the controller, and here I have the Little Fokker V3.1. It's all reliable. It's what I've been using for 2.5 years now. In that time, plenty of other controllers and whatnot have come out, but I'm someone that I really don't like getting experimental with my builds. I just like them to be as simple and reliable as possible, and the Little Fokker's never done me wrong. For the same reason, I don't really run anything too special like lights, tail lights, anything like that. I just keep my boards pretty simple. So in here, just Little Fokker V3.1, and right now that's in a Floatbox CXC enclosure. I do plan on swapping over to the box that we recently developed called The Box. Right now we're working on different compatibility solutions to work with the Superflux connector. So once that's all dialed, I think I'm gonna be swapping over to that one. So in the rear, I've got a torque box, and inside it, we've got a ZBMS, and I actually have a custom 80 volt pack that's 19S 2P with P42A cells. That was built by Indy Speed Control for me. For reference, a GT battery is 76 volts. That's 18S 2P of the same P42A cells. So this battery basically just has another pair of cells for you. It's gonna get you just a little bit more power than a GTV, essentially, a little bit more range. Disclaimer, this custom battery is definitely a tight fit in here. You really gotta make sure it's built well, built properly. And even then, it's just a really tight fit. It's not something I would personally recommend for the everyday person. Even in my second build, I just have an 18S 2P pack of P45B cells, and that thing has plenty of power for basically anybody. This thing, I just wanted to get just a little bit more power, whatever I could get for racing purposes. Now I've seen some builds online, and I am also interested in trying out a 126 volt build. I've seen some people doing 30S 1P packs, kind of similar to what the GTS series battery is. And I think that paired with maybe like a Pint S series motor would just be the ultimate sort of lightweight ripper, but that's for a future build. Now bumpers, of course, I'm gonna be running Bang bumpers. It's just the go-to, never done me wrong. In the back, I've got a torque Bang bumper, just so it's compatible with the torque box in the rear, since that torque box is a little bit bigger. And then in the front, of course, I've got the Nico Pro model colorway. Can't go wrong with black and red, it's sick. These bumpers are durable as heck. I've personally never run through a set. I've even got my first ever set from whenever these things came out, like 3 years ago now, something like that. So yeah, they're great. All right, moving on to the motor. So in my race board, I personally run a Superflux high-speed motor just for racing. The power delivery at speed is predictable, it's confidence inspiring, it has no problem staying cool. It's a really nice high performance motor, but it is heavy. It's heavy as heck and you feel it under your feet, at least for me. So for everyday riding, my secondary board actually has just a normal XR Hypercore motor, but with a pint hub. That pint hub is slightly narrower this way than the normal XR Hypercore. And I think that really shapes the tire nicely. It gives you a bit more sidewall going over the rim, which kind of gives like a suspension feeling on the edge. And just the lighter motor in general gives you a lot more control. You can throw the board around, feels more comfortable controlling it in the air. So for everyday riding, I do prefer that one. But for racing, you can't argue with the performance of the Superflux. It is a beefy boy. So this one's interesting. I have actually got some custom axle blocks. They're called pub hubs. They were designed by Odd and Huff. I personally bought mine through PEV Dispensary, but the pub hub design is actually public. It's open source. You can find it on printables. So you can even get them made yourself through a machine shop or however else you want to do it. Now, the reason I went with these versus the stock axle carriers that come with the Superflux is they have height adjustment. So of course you have the normal stock height like any other axle block, but with these blocks you're actually able to raise or lower the rails by a little less than ½ an inch. So with my big tire builds, I personally prefer dropping them from the stock height. Between the big tire and the rails I run, which give you a bit more clearance, it does naturally sit a little bit higher. So I like to bring my board back down so that my clearance is about the same as a stock XR, but your feet are just sitting lower. So it's a really nice, stable ride. And with the way I ride, I personally use remote tilt, which alleviates most of my clearance issues for the most part. So I like to trade that off for stability any day of the week personally. What remote tilt is, we'll get to that at the end of the video, but let's move on. Now I did just mention the rails, so let's move on to those. For the rails, I have XR, BTG, Steep and Deep, WTF rails. I know that's a lot. We'll get to what all that means. But first, starting with just this colorway, it is fun metal, but it's not just any fun metal. It is my own custom Nico Pro model colorway. It's got my own logo on it with the sort of Vesk inspired design. I love this thing. It's a one-of-one set of rails and I could not dig it more, especially with the wear and tear. It just looks sick. As for WTF, that basically just means from the axle height, you're gonna get a drop and then the foot pads angle up slightly. This angle up gets you back any clearance you might have lost from this drop. So you still get the same clearance, but you are maintaining a sort of lower platform height, which just gets you more stability. And then with the extra angles, you also have more to leverage against for pushing out against the board. A lot of times when I'm riding straight rails, it really feels like my feet could just slide out, especially if your nose is down or your tail is down. The whole foot pad is angled down, so it feels like your feet can just slide right off. So I've always been a fan of WTFs ever since I started riding them when they first came out like 3 years ago. So yeah, can't go wrong with that. Now, typically WTFs are angled 3.5 degrees in the nose and the tail. Now these are steep and deeps, so these are actually angled a bit more. It's the same drop, but they're angled up 5 degrees instead of the 3.5. And what that means is you're actually getting a bit more clearance than stock. The trade-off is because of that, especially if you have a wider stance, your feet are gonna be sitting slightly higher. But like I said, with my axle carriers, I like to drop it anyways, so that's not really a huge issue for me. And with the extra angles, you have even more leverage to push out against the board. And I've always liked that for aggressive riding. If it was just a chill all around like street board, even mellow trails, I'd probably prefer just normal WTFs. But for racing especially, steep and deeps are the way to go for me. And finally, BTG. So that stands for Big Tire Gang. Essentially all it means is these rails are extended from the normal length. Normally the rails end about here. So we open up this wheel well to allow for a taller tire, We already have a video on exactly what that means for BTG, but essentially a taller tire is gonna get you MTE-like suspension on still a 6-inch rim. So even though it's a 6-inch rim, you still have plenty of sidewall here. It's really nice cushion for just eating them chunk. The taller diameter also gets you a little bit higher top speed. It definitely feels more confidence inspiring at top speed versus a shorter tire. It climbs through chunk more easily. And because it's taller, when you hit any kind of chunk, obstacles, rocks, whatever, the angle that thing is hitting your tire at is actually more mellow rather than like a head-on into the face of the tire. So any kind of obstacles really just feel less jarring in general. So for racing, it's always been my go-to. It is by far the most confidence-inspiring build for me. So that's what I love personally. So for BTG, the go-to tire is usually a Burris. It's the Burris 11.5 by 7. That tire is really closer to 11.8 inches, so it is a taller tire. That tire is a great tire for racing. A lot of us have been using it in the last year, and it's definitely been a game changer, but it's really not for everyone. It's pretty boaty to turn, especially if you don't have footholds. It's really hard to leverage the tire. It can be kind of easy to disconnect from the board in a way. If you have footholds, you can kind of tank through those wobbles and whatnot. That said, I do think there could be better, and that does bring us to our first of a few prototype items we're gonna show off today. So this is the BTG Thundercat, or as I like to call it, the Big Cat. It is a 12 by 6.75 by 6 tire. Really what we're trying to do with this thing is just improve on the gripes that we had with the Burris. So first off, it is a full 12 inches tall. We're really trying to just fill up the entirety of the space we have in these rails to maximize tire size, maximize clearance as much as possible. The big Burris tire is pretty tall, but it is slightly short of what can fit in these rails. So we're really just trying to take advantage of these rails as much as possible. It also has a similar cushy, soft compound like the Burris does. That really just helps you eat up any kind of chunk you find on the trail. Now, like I said, that Burris is pretty boaty to turn, so we're really trying to go in a different direction with the shape for this one, just to give everyone a unique option on the market for big tires that's not currently out there. So I can't really show it off here because this is a V1 prototype. We've actually got our V2 in now that's fairly substantially different, and we're still working to improve it. So I can't show it off exactly how it's going to be, but the idea that we're going for is that this tire is gonna have a narrower width than the Burris and also steeper shoulders as it rounds out to the sidewall. That basically just means turns are gonna be a lot easier to initiate, and the turning radius when you're getting on edge is going to be tighter even at speed. This basically just means you have a rapid and predictable response. You can do really tight carves really fast, including at speed. Now, of course, we're going for a racing tire. We wanna make sure it's still stable. How can we make up for that loss of width? Well, the Burris gets its stability basically from being really wide. If you look at the profile though, it's actually pretty rounded edge to edge. There really is no exact defined flat spot on top. So that's where we're doing things a little bit differently. While our tire is going to be narrower and have steeper shoulders, we are also going to have a little flat spot on the crown here. It's pretty similar to what we've done with the MTE Pioneer, and that tire is basically our favorite around here. So we're just inspired by that. We're going to have a flat crown right here. That's basically a stability strip. It's something to just keep you nice and stable as you're doing straight line, high speed things, going through chunk, tanking through things. And what that flat spot's also gonna do is if you get in any kind of wobbles, once you cross over that center, it's just gonna snap right there. If you have a really rounded tire, even something as wide as the Burris, what can happen is a wobble overshoots and goes to the other edge. And that's when you really start getting a wobble that gets worse and worse. A lot of people have experienced this with the Burris. So even being a narrower tire, I think this tire is actually gonna be pretty damn stable, and I'm really excited for it. Now, of course, we've also gotta mention this insane looking tread. It really is a game changer. Of course, the Burris is treaded too, but I've ridden this thing quite a bit already, and the traction difference is just night and day. It really is a game changer, especially when you're on the edge. We've got this really chunky gaps between the treads right where you need it on edge, and it makes a huge difference, especially in the loose trails we have around here on the West Coast. I can take hard carves at speed, no problem. On the burst, I'm always having to slow down and be a lot more hesitant. So that's just been a game changer for me. And especially in a racing context, I mean, with the power that we have nowadays, traction can actually pretty often be the bottleneck that you're running into, especially with like the loose trails we have around here. A lot of times you're slipping out earlier than you're just maxing out on power. So with the traction, I'm really excited to see how that actually holds up in a racing context. All right, that's about it for the tire, and we're gonna move on to foot pads. So for this specific build, I do have a symmetrical front and rear Kush Lo. So normally I actually prefer a Kush Wide in the back. The Kush Wide has a bit more of a kick to it, and especially when I'm not rocking footholds or anything like that, I like using that higher kick basically as a foot stop to leverage against, to keep my feet in place and just really have control over the board. But when I'm rocking footholds, it's not really necessary. I have plenty to leverage against already. So instead, I like to keep things symmetrical. I like to keep the platform height as low as possible, since the foot hooks alone already give me plenty of control. Now, normally a front Kush Lo is a DIY project, but now that's luckily no problem thanks to the sensor tech that we've been developing for a while now. We've been working really hard to get this thing dialed for you guys. Obviously, these are still prototypes. They're not available quite yet, but I promise we'll let you guys know as soon as they are ready. Just please hang in there. Thank you. Now, I don't typically have engagement issues with sensors nowadays. Ever since I switched to VESC, I make sure to configure my boards so that any kind of sensor disengagement while you're riding is unlikely to nearly impossible in some situations. That said, there are definitely still plenty of benefits that I really love about this front Kush Lo. One of those things is this soft urethane. It's a really nice soft compound, so it absorbs shocks over time, and that really adds up over the course of a long ride, especially on trails. I definitely find my feet a lot less stressed at the end of a long ride compared to if I was running wood or plastic foot pads. Now with that urethane, that also means this pad is extremely freaking durable. It's really gonna hold up to whatever you can throw at it, not just because the material itself is super durable, but also with the new sensor tech, we're not dealing with a lot of the same issues that sensors have been at risk to in the past. You don't really have to worry about this thing getting punctured. You don't have to worry about any kind of dirt or debris getting under the sensor or the sensor peeling up or anything like that. The way it's built, it's built to last. So especially with the way I ride and racing, I'm just super stoked on this thing. Finally, the thing I love most about these foot pads is that they are compatible with our brand new Kush Hooks foothold system, affectionately nicknamed. That is right, people. Hell is frozen over, pigs are flying, and the TheFloatLife has officially gotten into the foothold game. Now, Robert absolutely killed it with the design of these. It really has been a blast working with him and Jeff on getting these things dialed throughout the year, just dialing in every single detail about them to get them to where they are now. And I'm in love. They're freaking awesome. I will stress again, these are prototypes, but you will certainly hear from me when they're ready for you guys. Now, I don't want to ramble too much here, but I would like to give some backstory here, starting with a massive freaking shout out to Riley Johnson and his Control Freaks foothold system. Now, there's a ton of foothold options out there nowadays, especially, but for the longest time, none of them has really sat well with me for one reason or another. However, Control Freaks absolutely paved the way toward what I believe a foothold should be, and there's no doubt that its inspiration shines through in how our own take was developed. So we are extremely excited about how far we've come with our own project, and excited to bring it to the masses, especially before you DIYers looking for an open source option and maybe a project for yourselves. Definitely feel free to check out Control Freaks on Instagram at control_freaks. That's CTRL_freaks. And while you're at it, definitely give Riley himself a follow as well at floats_the most. Now to explain how we arrived at our design, I first want to talk about some of the issues I have with some of the alternatives out there, and then show our approach to handling these concerns. So the first gripe I have about some of the systems out there is that some of them don't really support a more natural stance. You have a lot of them that kind of just support this toe area where your toes are in there, but your heel is free to swing back and forth that way. So I'm someone that I do definitely, for racing context, prefer a sort of outward pressure foothold system. It feels more natural, I think. It feels more akin to riding without footholds, because without footholds, you're kind of pushing out to have leverage against the grip tape. So the same technique applies here. But when you're missing out on this back half and you have no support for your heel in a natural stance, I think you're really missing out on a lot of leverage there. Now there are some wider ones that support your full foot, but to take advantage of that full support, you have to have a parallel stance basically with your front foot really flat. I just can't do that. I've always been someone that angles their front foot forward. It feels more natural to me. I feel like I have more control, and maybe more important than anything else, it's easier to bail out of that stance. It has you have your torso a bit more forward. So it just feels more natural to go straight into a run out. So with our design, we're designing it around a more natural stance, and we have full support from your toes all the way through your heels. In this way, in basically any scenario, you're able to apply outward pressure through the entirety of your foot. You feel like you're fully secure, and at that point, you really don't have to worry about your foot position. You're just locked into place. Now, on the topic of being locked into place, there are a lot of foothold options out there that I believe just have too much damn hook. Now, at first, in a lot of ways, that might seem like a great thing. If you're riding really aggressively, you just want to be locked in as much as possible to stay connected and have as much control over the board as possible. But I firmly believe that with the right design, you really don't need that much hook as long as you have good technique when you're riding with those footholds. So with our footholds, we definitely still have a decent bit of hook here, but it's not quite as much as a lot of the other options out there. That said, when you are actively applying pressure outwards and actually pushing into the hook, it's about as damn grip as you could really ever need. I've done plenty of jumping on this board, even just jumping from flat, lifting the entire board up. As long as you're using good technique and you are actively pushing outward, it's got everything you need. Now, the benefit of having not quite as much hook, but still as much as you could need, is it's a lot easier to bail from. Your feet are not stuck under the hook. You really have to be actively pushing outwards to be locked in. So when you're just trying to bail out, you kind of naturally release that pressure and your foot ends up sliding right out. So I've already had a good number of bails in these things, and I run it out almost every damn time. Obviously, still not gonna be quite as safe to run out as just running no footholds. That's really not anything you can avoid. But compared to a lot of the other options out there, I certainly prefer these for that reason. And it's important to note that with footholds as well, with the extra control you have, you do end up getting into those bail situations a lot less, at least in my experience. Now, do keep in mind that that does mean you can't get lazy with these. Some of the other hooks can let you get a little bit lazy with your stance. You can let your guard down and still be locked in. With these, you gotta be pushing outwards. It becomes a workout, definitely. But at the end of the day, I really think running footholds like these helped me build a lot better technique of just like constantly thinking about pushing outwards and really leveraging against my board and everything I do. And it has totally changed how I ride. Now, one other thing about some of the alternatives out there, like I said, a lot of the hook options out there kind of really just cover this toe portion, and either they have a section for your heel, but you have to have your feet parallel, or they just don't have anything at all. So with those options, what ends up happening a lot of the time is when you're trying to do a steep sort of toe side turn, you end up lifting your heel a lot to really push into that toe side because you have nothing to leverage against with the bridge of your foot. And with that disconnect, you can get in a lot of situations where you just don't have quite as much control over the board, and the board can end up tipping this way. and then you disconnect from the board. It can get really sketchy. So with our design, we've actually basically just modeled it close to the shape of a normal everyday foot, everyday shoe. So with this design, it matches the bridge of your foot, and because of that, as long as you're pushing outward, when you're doing a toe side turn, you have all of this to really leverage against, and your heel stays pretty firmly planted, or at the very least, pretty dang close to the foot pad. So you have way more control over the board, even in a tight toe side turn. For me, in my riding, that's definitely been a game changer. It's one of those things that I didn't realize was missing until I had it, and it's really hard to go back to any other option right now for that reason. I'm surprised not a lot of other guys are doing that, but it feels great. On that note, with our design, we've also got a few options for a little bit of modularity just to make sure that fitment is just right for your foot. Obviously, we've got tracks that you can move these along to get this in the right foot position for your board, just heel to toe side. And then we've also got different spacers we're gonna offer that basically change the angle that this sits at relative to your toe or heel. That's basically just to make sure you have good contact with your foot all the way across the bridge to your toes. And of course, you could even throw in some flat spacers in there to lift it, just to make sure it matches the height of your shoe as well. So lots of different ways to really tinker with the shape and the positioning to get it just right. And right now, I've also got this mount that has my foot sort of at this near like 45-degree angle. But of course, this leaves the door open for maybe potential future mounts as well, with slightly different shapes, slightly different angles. There's also nothing stopping you from throwing one of these rear ones on the front. If you really want to have that parallel stance, you can go for it. Oh, and of course, we've also got this foam on the inside that really helps with absorbing shock and just making it a comfy fit. But there's really nothing stopping you from throwing whatever kind of foam in here. You could get some thicker foam to make it even tighter, more comfy, cushy fit. The choice is up to you. So combine all that with the comfortable urethane and the shape of the Kush Lo, and this whole foothold foot pad setup is really one of the most comfortable setups I've personally ever ridden, at least for racing. Seriously, I couldn't be more excited to get to share this with you guys and for all you guys to give it a shot. It's definitely gonna be a fun race season, that's for damn sure. Now there's one last thing about my setup to cover, and that's this. The Build Kit Boards Voyager Remote. This is the V1, but once BKB finishes up the updates they're working on for one-wheel compatibility, I do plan on switching over to the brand new V2 that they offer. So if you're out of the loop, this is used for something called remote tilt. This allows you to control your board's angle in real time as you're riding. This is an idea I had for years, and thanks to Vesk, I was finally able to actually implement it into the board around 2 years ago. Since then, it's basically become an integral part of the trail riding experience for me. Is it necessary? Not at all, but the extra control and safety just completely changed the game for me. Now the biggest application is definitely in transitions and being able to anticipate what's coming up ahead. So for example, you could raise your nose for an upcoming uphill or a kicker, or even going into a berm. You could lower the nose for a downhill landing, or maybe coming out the tail end of tabletops. You could even raise your nose a bit if you're looking ahead and see some chunk, just so you have a little bit of extra headroom, some nose clearance in case your nose dips in that chunk. Along with that, you can even lower your nose as you brake for basically emergency brakes, being able to brake as hard as you want. And in the same idea, you can raise your nose as you're accelerating to keep it off the ground and accelerate as hard as the board will let you. This is all stuff that's basically impossible to predict on a firmware level, but with remote tilt, you have the control to anticipate what's coming up. Again, it's not for everyone, but for me, it's allowed me to sort of enter a flow state like no other. My muscle memory with the remote takes care of basically any clearance concerns, so all I have to focus on is how I'm flowing through a trail, which is a pretty special feeling. It's definitely a don't knock it till you try it kind of thing. Now, for those of you who are curious, I've actually got mine set up with a 20-degree max tilt angle. And the tilt speed is pretty snappy at 100 degrees per second. This basically gets you an instant response as soon as you're tilting the joystick. So that high max tilt angle is necessary for aggressive riding because you kind of have to account for any tilt the board already has. Think about if you're accelerating really hard, you can get your nose like fairly low to the ground depending on how your tune is. So even though 20 degrees from level is with tail basically on the ground, imagine if you're accelerating hard enough for your nose to already be on the ground, a 20-degree tilt from there is just gonna bring your board to level. So if you only have that at like 5 degrees or something like that, you're really not gonna get quite as much out of the board. So I like to put it at 20 degrees. Sometimes if I'm doing something crazy, I'll even put it at like 25. Now with that plus the high tilt speed, you definitely gotta have a little bit more precision in how you're using the joystick. For some, that might come sooner than others, might come easier than others. I grew up playing games and whatnot, so maybe it comes to me better than it might for some others. But over time, you will develop a muscle memory. It really, over time, kind of just disappears into the ride. For me, it's not something I ever think about. It's just become an extension of my body, the same as anything else. So I'm not thinking about, oh, I gotta tilt the joystick up as this hill's coming up. My thumb just kind of does what it needs to for the board to be at the angle I want it to be at any point in time. Like I said, it lets you just focus on the actual riding, it lets you focus on the trail and how you're flowing. It lets you focus on lines ahead without having to think about, okay, how do I have to brake or accelerate into this to get the board at the right angle? It just clears up a lot of space in your head so you can just focus on the fun. At the end of the day, it is definitely worth the extra learning curve, in my opinion. And that's about it. Thanks so much, everyone, for sticking with me. Thanks, Lige, for sticking with me. This one was a long time coming, so I wanted to make sure I was able to do it justice and spill all the details that I could. That said, if you have any questions at all, or if you know who you want to see rep their set in a future video, feel free to drop it down in the comments below. Till next time, float on, my friends.